much. Thank you for that. So let me start off by saying, first of all, I find it very humorous that Farina is our timekeeper, because yesterday at our seminar, when we got together, it took us 2 hours just to say hello to one another. It really did. So, all right. No, that's fine. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. So I want to start off by saying, first of all, I want to acknowledge my friend Thomas and Stephanie as well for giving me some feedback on an earlier draft. What I'm going to do is I'm going to present to you just a very quick summation of this so we can fit within 20 minutes of our session today. So here's what I propose to do. I propose to just do a deep dive into a particular passage that you can find in the Book of Mormon. I'll show you the reference in just a moment. What I find interesting in doing this textual analysis is that, it's interesting is that, Foucault is credited with the saying, every concept deconstructs itself. In graduate school, I learned it a little bit more like every text deconstructs itself. But it's the idea, and I said credited because, again, there's some controversy about whether he actually said that or not. But the concept, nonetheless, I think is one that is a valid one as we consider texts. And I also want to bring to this a little bit of standpoint theory. If you're familiar with this, this comes out of Black feminist criticism. And it's essentially the recognition that from where you stand in terms of society and economy and politics and so forth, and race as well, it influences then your perspective on what you see and what you don't see. I mean, it's a very common sense kind of notion, but we need to recognize that first. It's a human fallacy or a failing, right? That we all are informed by where we stand given a number of issues as well. So given that, here's what I want to do. I want to do a close reading of this letter from Gideon High to Laconius. I'm going to assume a little familiarity with the Book of Mormon text, but I'll try and explain as much as I can as we go along. So this is found in 3 Nephi chapter 3, verse 11. And the moment of this particular letter is that Laconius is the chief governor of the Nephite nation, and he receives this letter from an outlaw, effectively, Gideon High. They are characterized, he leads a group that's characterized as Gadianton robbers. And this letter is essentially a demand for reparations. That's essentially what this is about. Now, what Laconius does is he essentially tears it up and throws it away, right? So here's what the narrative says about this particular moment when this letter comes to the chief governor demanding reparations. And he says this, the narrative says, and now it came to pass when Laconius received this epistle, he was exceedingly astonished. And I find it to be very important because of the boldness of Gideon High demanding the possession of the land of the Nephites and also of threatening the people and avenging the wrongs of those that had received no wrong, save it were they had wronged themselves by dissenting away onto those wicked and abominable robbers. So in other words, right, they're the problem, right? Now behold, this Laconius could not be frightened by the demands and the threatenings of a robber. Therefore, he did not hearken to the epistle of Gideon High. So the appeal, and effectively what happened, I should also explain this as well, is that the Nephite nation was essentially surrounded. It had been undermined from a variety of what I would characterize as strategic military hits to really undermine domestic security. And so at a particular moment, Gideon High then sends this letter to Laconius and basically says, look, we will call a peace, but you need to recognize certain things. And this is the moment then. Laconius receives it, can't believe what he says, and he basically throws it away, right? So here's a question that I ask. Did Laconius' standpoint as a Nephite and as a political and social elite bind him to the grievances of what I characterize as the natives of Zarahemla, right? Now, very, very quickly, let me just go through this. This is a graph that I created so you kind of understand this kind of the political trajectory that you find in the Book of Mormon narrative. It begins with the original story of the colony of Lehi. Nephi breaks away eventually from that colony to form his own kingdom. He wanted to be pronounced, or they wanted to pronounce him king. They then create their own Nephite kingdom. Mosiah at some point breaks away from that kingdom, and that's when they find, as they wander the wilderness, the people of Zarahemla. That's essentially where we are in this nation. So I want you to understand this succession of secessions from various kingdoms to this point that they're in right now. And of course, King Benjamin, if you know the story, tried to unite the both people of Zarahemla and Mosiah together. And the name that he gave them was the children of Christ. All right, let's go on. Yeah, all right. So here are some important things to step back about and understand about this moment when the people of Mosiah, essentially the Nephites, when they came and found the city of Zarahemla. And what's interesting is what's described in Omni 12 through 13. The people of Mosiah, they were characterized by their strong affinity to the law of Moses. They were a believing, practicing people. They were admonished continually by the word of God. And so this is religiously and culturally, this is what defined them, was this very, very strong affinity. In fact, that's why they broke away from the first Nephite kingdom, was because kind of in a pilgrim, American pilgrim-like fashion, right? They felt that the old kingdom was too worldly and they wanted to remain loyal to what they believed. So by culture and religion, it's important to understand that the people of Mosiah, the Nephites, were defined by the law of Moses. Now, when they came, this is also in the narrative, what you find, and it's Second Nephi, Mosiah, Helaman as well. There's textual evidence that they were metallurgists, engineers, architects, craftsmen, artists as well. That basically they knew how to plan, to build, to grow things. And they were also herders. And so they knew how to domesticate animals and benefit from the production of domestication as well. Now, when they come to the land of Zarahemla and they find the city of Zarahemla, what is then described in the narrative is the exact opposite of how the Nephites understood themselves, right? So to begin with, Amaleki Malachi describes the people of Mulek, the natives of Zarahemla, in Omni 17 as this, is that they were a faction-riven people who had endured many wars and serious contention. So they were not a united people to begin with. They appear illiterate. They have no records. They're able to recall their history only through stories and legends. In fact, there's a passage that talks about Zarahemla, who was the leader of the city of Zarahemla, who gave a genealogy of his fathers. He could only do it orally. And through memory. There were no written records as well. And there's a passage which I find very instructive in the narrative that refers to the language of the Mulekites as having become corrupted. And the Nephites, when they came across the land of Zarahemla, they could not understand the people of Mulek at all. And so this last line, Mosiah caused that they should be taught in his language. Again, I find highly, highly interesting. This is what colonial people do. So I want you to understand now, see, people of Mosiah, they left, they were refugees, they were immigrants seeking a new land. They found a new land. And rather than learn the language of the land that they found or the people they found, they caused them to learn their language. And once they could speak in the Nephite language, then the story goes on. Now, the narrative just blows right past it. It's just a passing line. But I think it's important to understand this dynamic because this then frames what I believe is the underlying story of the narrative as we go forward. So the people of Mosiah, as they were defined in terms of their religious culture, they appear to have no defined belief or worship, at least in a way that made any sense to the Nephite people at all, right? Amaleki observed that they denied the being of their creator. I'm not exactly sure what that meant. I don't know if it meant that they denied a creator deity to begin with, or that their creator had any form of being. I don't know. But nonetheless, again, from a Nephite perspective, they couldn't understand anything about Mulekite religion as well. So the reason why this is important is that there is, again, textual evidence that what becomes the Nephite nation, this is the alliance between the people of Mulek and the people of Zarahemla, is a segregated nation. They lived as a segregated people. Here's the reason why I suggest this. When you take a look at Mosiah 1, verses 10 to 11, this is the moment where King Benjamin realizes that he's getting on in age. He wants to pass the kingdom on to his son Mosiah. He calls his sons together, and this is what he says. I would that you should make a proclamation throughout all this land among all this people, or the people of Zarahemla and the people of Mosiah who dwell in the land. And it's interesting that he had to define what he meant. And in defining what he meant by all this people, he says there are two camps, people of Zarahemla, people of Mosiah, that they thereby may be gathered together. I shall give this people a name, that they thereby may be distinguished above all the people which the Lord God hath brought out of this land of Jerusalem. Now, there's more evidence again, that they existed as a segregated nation. Further in the book of Mosiah, chapter 25. Now, this is after King Benjamin has passed on. He's given the kingdom to his son Mosiah. This is not the Mosiah who wrote the book of Mosiah, but in other words, it's his son Mosiah. So this is now this is the son of King Benjamin. King Mosiah also calls together a national assembly, and you find this. And there were not so many of the people of Nephi as the people of Zarahemla, and as there were of the Lamanites. They were not half so numerous. We'll come back to this. And now all the people of Nephi were assembled together, and also the people of Zarahemla, and they were gathered together in two bodies. Again, so there's very clear textual evidence that there was effectively a segregated nation. So think in terms of different languages, different belief structures, different religious culture. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Two very different people that were trying to make alliance. Now, very quickly, Mosiah, I just want to acknowledge again, if you're familiar with the text, King Benjamin gives this address that is quite revered among Latter-day Saints. And I just want to point that when you understand this, which is interesting, then you understand that some of the commentary appears to have been addressed to people who had substance, that had resources. I'm sorry. Let me start off again. He appears to be speaking to people who have great difficulty with social relations. And so he says, for example, and you will not have a mind to injure one another, but to live peaceably and to render every man according to that which is due. And you will not suffer your children that they go hungry or naked. Neither will you suffer that they transgress the laws of God and fight and quarrel with one another. He's not addressing a nation that, again, that is defined tightly by the law of Moses, so tightly that they, in fact, broke away. He's actually referring to how the people of Zarahemla were referred to earlier. And then it almost as if then he turns to the other audience. And then he says, and also ye yourselves will succor those that stand in need of your succor. You will minister of your substance unto him that standeth in need, and you will not suffer that the beggar putteth up his petition to you in vain. And you will not, let's go on, just very summarize very quickly. In 17, you will not blame the beggar for a situation, but you will then provide what they need, right? And so he goes on. So that is a comment directed towards people who had resources. You will not deny people who need things, right? And so again, I think this is all textual evidence that there were two segregated communities living together. And then the last one as well, he says this: believe in God, believe that he created all things both in heaven and earth. I won't read the rest of it, but he was not speaking again to a people who defined themselves by worship and by the law of Moses. He was speaking to a people who had great difficulty, at least accepting and understanding the Nephite religion, right? So again, all of this is, I believe, is textual evidence, again, that the Nephite nation, as it's just glossed over in the narrative, was actually a segregated community to begin with. And I find this last one I want to share with you. This is Mosiah chapter 6. So after Benjamin finishes his address, he passes the kingdom off to his son Mosiah. Then you find this passage in verse 7. And it's this, is that, and King Mosiah did cause his people that they should till the earth. Who would be affected by this royal decree? Remember that when the Nephites came, they broke away. The people of Mosiah, when they came to Zarahemla, they were already characterized as herders and as farmers as well. Again, I think this royal decree that the rest of the kingdom also had to become tillers of the earth would only influence those who weren't previously, speaking to the people of Zarahemla, right? So, yeah, and I find it very interesting that it took a royal decree to make sure that farming is practiced throughout the land. And again, I believe that the people of Mulek, or the natives of Zarahemla, were the ones that were all affected. Now, what does this all mean? Bringing this together. So there is no census ever provided in the Book of Mormon, but there are relative population estimates given. And this one is from Mosiah chapter 25. And so I've kind of broken up this pie chart. The people of Ammon are converted Lamanites. And we'll just pause for a moment that there is some common understanding of what that term means. That's another discussion altogether. But they were the majority of the people living in the Nephite kingdom. And then the second largest group are the people of Mulek, and the smallest people, or the smallest group of the people of Mosiah, the Nephites. So I want you to think about that for just a moment. The politically powerful, the militarily powerful, the religiously powerful, they were the minority population. And they controlled then other people who did not connect with them culturally or in other ways as well. So this is what I want to propose, is I do think there's textual evidence that the Nephites operated as a colonial power. Thank you. As again, the people of Mosiah, they brought resources and knowledge that overtook the economy of Zarahemla. And the Nephites, there's very clear textual evidence as well, is that the Nephites occupied all positions of power: military, religious, political. In fact, they were dynastic in many ways, from father to son. So again, what I'm trying to paint for you is a picture of a kingdom that's ruled almost like South Africa during apartheid, or perhaps Israel now relative to the Palestinians. It was, and it's very clear that Nephite worship was never embraced by the nation as a whole, and the alliance between Mosiah and Mulek was fractured from the very beginning. And here's the last thing I want to share with you relative to that. I find it very interesting is that the narrators of the Book of Mormon continually refer to the people collectively as the Nephites. And remember, they're the minority population. What that effectively does is it erases the identity of the people of Zarahemla, and certainly the converted Lamanites as well, completely erases them, and is basically saying we're all Nephites, when in fact they were not, politically or religiously or so forth and so on, right? And so it was an erasure that happened. So here's, I'm suggesting this, is that the Nephites operated as a colonial power, and there appears to be, this is the cause of underlying resentment. And I know I've got a few minutes to share with you, but all throughout the narrative, it's basically a narrative of fighting off against factions and revolts and challenges to power of authority. It happens all throughout the narrative. And I want to propose, could this be nationalist resentment towards a colonial power? Could that be what underwrote much of that rebellion? And again, here's a modern example of this. So was Mulekite nationalism the underlying cause of challenges to religion and religious authorities? Now, I won't read this, but I wanted to share this with you. Again, in the interest of time, we can't read this, but at least, again, I find that middle line, if you go down 4 lines, where Gideoni is basically saying, look, I'm writing this letter in the hopes that you will deliver up your lands or your possessions, that we may recover our rights and government. I think that's telling. That's very, very telling from the perspective of the people of Zarahemla. And then I'll just summarize with this. I mean, his grievances were this, that his people were denied their right to self-rule. They were dominated by a foreign people and treated like slaves. Their land and resources have been taken from them. Foreign worship was imposed upon them. A foreign lifestyle was imposed upon them as well. So this is the question I ask you to ponder. Is it, given this interpretation, that effectively what happened was that the Nephites operated as a colonial power? Did they operate much like modern Israelis, and were the Gadiantans essentially like the Palestinian liberation? I'll just throw this to you here. What's interesting is, from that perspective, then all of these figures that you find in the narrative that are described as antichrists or in very negative terms, there seems to be a line that runs through all of them, and all of it is challenging Nephite authority and their right to rule. And so again, I ask that question: is effectively what is happening then a revolt against a colonial power? Lastly, we have Gadianton and Gideoni. Now, I just want to suggest, in the interest of time, I just need to summarize very quickly that Nephites occupied a position of power and authority. And that power and authority, their standpoint, blinded them to the realities that were before them. They were literally before them. They could not see the injustices. They believed that God had given them the land, that God had given them the right to rule. And effectively what they did is it was a justification for colonialism. So what is dismissed in the narrative as secret combinations, I want to suggest, was perhaps a revival of Mulekite religion and traditions that allowed the working class of the nation to communicate outside of Nephite surveillance, and that what the Nephites viewed as robbery were actually acts of Mulekite nationalists to take back what they believe had been stolen from them. And from that perspective, it's interesting is in the number of assassinations then that are characterized in the narrative, they then start to look like political hits against the colonial power to destabilize their regime. So yeah, okay, I've got to finish with this, and I'll just have to go through this. But I think from this perspective, what's interesting is that when you view the Book of Mormon narrative from this socioeconomic ethno perspective, it becomes a very, very interesting story about colonial powers that are ultimately undermined by the native community that eventually rise up to overthrow them, which is a very interesting story. Now, we don't have time to then contemplate the implications of that. But again, considering when this came out, when it was published in 1830, that's an interesting message. All right. So with that, I will end it, and then I will turn it over to Farina. Are you next? Okay, here you go. Thank you.